On July 4th, 2026, America will celebrate its 250th birthday. The United States is the world's oldest and still evolving experiment in democracy. Hello, and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm USA Today Editor-in-Chief Karen Bohan. To commemorate this noteworthy birthday, I've asked journalists across the USA Today newsroom to embark on both literal and metaphorical journeys. From a political perspective, how have the last 250 years shaped the way this nation governs itself? And how have we, the governed, evolved in how we see ourselves? For more on these and other questions, I turn now to USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page, a journalist who has had the privilege of interviewing 10 presidents out of a total of just 45 over the course of her career. Susan, thanks for joining me.
Karen, it's great to be with you.
Susan, you have a terrific piece out this morning on the 250th birthday of the United States, in which you write about the American journey, both physical and metaphorical. Why did you choose the symbolism of a journey?
You know, America has never been only a destination. It's always been a journey. You think about 250 years ago, it was 13 colonies clustered along the Atlantic coast, and then we expanded and expanded across the entire continent. And it's been a metaphorical journey too, in that 250 years ago, just about the only people who had the vote were white men who owned property. Now we've had a situation where we've inaugurated a black president. We've seen a woman serve as Speaker of the House. We've had 8 members of the Supreme Court who are not white men who own property. So that has represented kind of the big expansion and changing nature of our country.
That journey hasn't always been smooth. You could argue it's a bit rocky now. Should Americans be worried?
Well, I think a lot of Americans are worried. It is a time of terrific partisan divide. Our last 3 presidential elections have been very close and fiercely fought. But Americans should remember that this isn't really new. We've had a rocky path before in our country. We fought a civil war. More than 600,000 Americans died in our Civil War. We had a depression. We've had world wars and terrorist attacks of 9/11. So it's not new to have strife and concern and challenges in our journey. You know, I was thinking even of our bicentennial. So 50 years ago, we celebrated our 200th birthday. And I think we all remember that as a pretty sunny time. But in fact, it had just been 3 years since the US forces had pulled out of Vietnam, a very divisive war. It was just 2 years since Richard Nixon became the only president forced to resign from office. So even at that time, we had just come through a period of real challenges.
Even though the country is turning 250, it's a sign of how young it is that only 45 people have held the office of the presidency. What characteristics do you think most of the 10 presidents you've interviewed have in common?
You know, they're smart, they're driven. They're driven not only by personal ambition, they're driven by their vision of where they would want to take the country. Now, they have different visions, sometimes conflicting ones, but those are the characteristics I think you see in all of the leaders that I've talked to.
Do you get the sense that optimism is baked into the fabric of the American spirit?
Absolutely. Americans are by their nature optimistic and ambitious and impatient. I mean, that's one reason the original colonists moved here from Europe, was because they wanted a different kind of country. They had a different kind of life they wanted to live. And I think that's in America's DNA. We see it even today in the entrepreneurship and the innovation that has characterized the United States.
Not all presidents have been optimistic. You interviewed President Richard Nixon just after he left office over the Watergate scandal. Tell us about that.
So I was a young reporter. It was 1984. Nixon invited a handful of young political reporters, people who had not covered him in the White House, to his home in Saddle River to talk about what he thought Reagan should do in his re-election campaign and what Reagan should do in the second term that he hoped to win. And everything was difficult for Nixon, right, since he was forced to leave in the wake of the Watergate scandal. But I think of this as a sign of optimism too, because he believed that if he could only reach a new generation of journalists, he could continue to make his case. He still had things he wanted to say and things he wanted to do. Now, he never really got past the Watergate scandal. That was the first line in his obituary everywhere it appeared. But he really never gave up on what he wanted to do, the impact he wanted to have on America.
You also interviewed President Bill Clinton, also no stranger to scandal. You write that you interviewed him on Air Force One 4 months after he survived an impeachment vote, yet you found him optimistic. Did that surprise you?
So he was impeached by the House, but then not convicted by the Senate. A very difficult time, and a mark on his presidency. The fact that he was the first modern president to be impeached was something that will forever be in the first line of his obituary whenever that day comes. But he was optimistic. He believed he could strike a deal, a landmark deal that would ensure the long-term sustainability, stability of the Medicare system. He could have been pessimistic because surviving that impeachment trial was a difficult thing, but he still, like Nixon, had some things that he wanted to do. He had some impact he wanted to have on the United States.
Susan, your most recent interview was with President Biden as he was preparing to leave office. What was your sense in that interview?
You know, this was remarkable. The interview with USA Today was the only interview Joe Biden did with a mainstream newspaper during his presidency. So it was, I felt it was a great responsibility. And this was in January as he was preparing to leave the White House, and in the wake of a lot of criticism and questions about whether he'd had the capacity to continue serving as president. And I think the thing he wanted to do in this interview was make the case that he did, that he was, although our oldest president, he was vigorous and informed and had things to say and had a perspective on his career. But the lead of that story was, I said, could you have won if you had stayed on the ticket? And he said, yes, I believe I could have won. And I said, could you have served for 4 more years? And he said, who the hell knows? And of course, Americans do not expect a president to be running for office and win office not feeling confident they can get through a term.
Absolutely. Of the 10 presidents you've interviewed, what was the most unexpected moment?
I mentioned that I interviewed Bill Clinton with my colleague Mimi Hall on Air Force One. It was at the end of a long day. We were flying back from Chicago, and we had arranged this interview. And Mimi and I had gone to Chicago so we could fly back with him and do the interview. And as we were getting on, I said to Joe Lockhart, who was then the White House press secretary, you need to give us some time here. You can't have this interview be at the very end of the flight. And he said, yes, I'll take care of that. So we're flying, and of course, we fly and fly and fly, and by the time they take us up to interview the president in his office on Air Force One, we were about to land at Andrews. And I said to Joe, you may not give us a 60-second interview. We've agreed to a longer interview then. He said, okay. So we land and we just sit there and talk, and it's the end of the day. This was the best possible time to interview Bill Clinton because he's a night owl. This is his favorite time to be talking. And we're having really quite a long interview. And I'm thinking, why hasn't Joe said we have to stop or said last question? And I glance over and Joe Lockhart has fallen asleep in his chair in this office. And so Mimi and I obviously just kept interviewing Clinton. The 3 of us were very happy to have this going. Lockhart finally wakes up and he realizes he has no idea how long we've been talking. He has no idea what the president has told us. And so he called the interview then.
That's amazing. With several presidents, including George W. Bush and Joe Biden, you interviewed them just as they were getting ready to leave office. Was it your sense that they were ready to pass the baton to the next guy?
You know, some presidents are never ready to leave. Clinton would have gladly stayed in the White House forever, and I think President Trump may feel that way too, if only the Constitution would allow. But you think about George W. Bush. I interviewed him in January, just as he was basically packing up the White House to leave. He had had the 9/11 attacks early in his first term. He had had the financial meltdown at the end of his second term. He was ready to turn the burdens of this office over to the next one.
Our Constitution has seen many changes over the last 250 years. And when it comes to the Supreme Court, they've interpreted that document in different ways at different times. When it comes to the current Supreme Court, how do you think they're interpreting it right now?
This is a pretty friendly court for President Trump. He appointed 3 of the 9 justices. Other Republican presidents appointed 3 other justices. They have been pretty friendly toward his efforts to expand executive authority in ways we've never seen it expanded before. And I think that's concerned some Americans. The Constitution is set up to have 3 equal, separate branches of government, and for there to be a balance of power among them. And one of the things that concerns some Americans now is the court acting as that check on executive power? And is the Republican-controlled Congress doing that?
Let's talk about the American voter. How has their engagement in politics changed?
So one of the things I think of real concern, even to the court itself, even to the Chief Justice, John Roberts, is this erosion of confidence in the Supreme Court, in the presidency, in the Congress, in the news media. This has been a serious trend, I think, in modern times, and something that all these institutions are trying to deal with and respond to.
Looking back over your career covering politics in Washington, do you get any sense that America can heal its deep divisions?
I've covered 12 presidential elections now. And one thing that has struck me over and over again is how much Americans love their country and how much Americans revere the Constitution. And they see the Constitution in different ways, they interpret it in different ways, they have different views of what the American dream ought to be. But that is something that just fundamentally ties us together.
What about you? Are you discouraged, optimistic?
I'm an American. I'm optimistic.
Susan, thank you for being on the Excerpt.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I'm USA Today Editor-in-Chief Karen Bohan. I'll see you next time.